Hey guys, so this is the PowerPoint about principles of design and composition. With this PowerPoint, basically what we're going to look at is going to be taking the elements of design, elements of art that we saw on the previous PowerPoint, and then how can we organize them within the composition of an artwork to make it interesting. So that's basically what the principles of design are for. You're going to notice in the PowerPoint as I show you the screen right here that the principles of design tend to be opposite forces that help with the overall balance of how things look. So you're going to have the first one, for example, is going to be unity and variety. Next one's going to be balance, and then emphasis and subordination, and contrast, repetition and rhythm, and then finally we're going to do scale and proportion. So let's go ahead and get started with the first one, which is unity and variety. So unity and variety, as I mentioned, these ones are complementary forces. With unity is the appearance or condition of oneness. What are the elements within a composition that makes everything look similar, right? That's what unity is. The similarity of objects that help create a sense of unity. Those it sounds pretty loose, pretty broad. So it's better sometimes to kind of actually look at a painting or a composition and see if this clarify it. So here we have going home, sorry, by Jacob Lawrence. And in here in this composition, what are some of the elements that make it all unified? Makes it all look similar. So you could say that you have color, right, all the way through. So it's not just black and white. So we have color. The fact that it's all color or different kinds of colors, that's a sense of unity. Now, the quality of the color is also a sense of unity. In other words, everything seems to be fairly flat. We don't have a lot of value in these colors, right? So even though we do have some shadows, of seems to be shadows, they're pretty flat. So the way that the painting or the color has been applied in this painting is pretty much the same. So it creates unity. What else here creates unity? The fact that most of the shapes and the forms in here are actually pretty much geometric, right? So you have rectangles, we have circles, you have semicircles, etc., all the way through, right? Lines and so forth and so on. And even the individuals, right? So if you look at the figures themselves, the figures are also fairly geometric. We would even describe those figures as abstracted in a geometric form. And all of them are abstracted at the same level, right? So in other words, like this individual right here that's kind of sleeping or whatever, it is not hyper realistic or is not very naturalistic compared to the rest of them. They're all at the same level of abstraction. So that is also an element that creates unity. Another thing that you can see throughout is that all of them are African Americans, right? So there is also that sense of unification throughout the composition, and in this case, also race. All right, so the other one, the opposite force, is going to be variety. Variety is just something that provides diversity within that same composition that has unity. Okay, so if we look at the same painting, we started talking about colors first, right? So even though we have a lot of colors, we can describe each color separately. So we have yellows, we have blues, we have greens, browns, etc. So that creates variety. There's all kinds of diversity within the same kind of sense of color. Also, we have a variety when it comes down to some of the elements, right? So all the shapes that we're talking about. They're not all squares or they're not all rectangles. The opposite, we have a whole bunch of different shapes. We have, like I mentioned before, semicircles, circles, rectangles, so forth and so on, lines. And even something that's kind of interesting here, the chairs, the shapes right here repeat themselves over and over again, except on this very last one, which this right here creates variety, right? This one chair here that's backwards. Also, we were talking about the figures. So there are different kinds of figures doing different things. They're not all standing. They're not all sitting down. They're not all facing the same direction. And if we look at them from a perspective of human beings, then we also have the fact that we have some young ones, we have some older ones, and so forth and so on, right? Now, the one thing that we could say there's no not a change between unity and variety, is going to be the race, right? So all of these individuals here seem to be African American. Now, at that point, if we were to look further into the meaning, quote unquote, of this painting, the fact that there's no variety in regards to race starts giving us a glimpse on what possibly Lawrence was trying to describe with this painting. However, if you want to find out more about the specific painting, I strongly suggest you do a little research about Florence and this specific painting of Going Home. Now, when it comes down to contemporary artworks, and you see artworks like this, right, in front of a museum, or most people are very dislocated, are very appalled by artworks that look like this in museums. And kind of to remind you guys, this kind of objects, the ones like that one I'm showing you, those kind of objects tend to be much in a conversation between artist to art world. And even though it is also artist to the audience have to be well informed of what the conversation is in order for you to really truly grasp and understand what is being done here. So anyway, so let's go back to it and let's apply the same unity and variety to something like this artwork, right? So this is Robert Rauschenberg's artwork from Apollo. And when we're looking at this specific sculpture, what are some of the elements that create unity, right? So if we step back, right, and remember that the best thing you can do in order to experience an artwork is to look to step back. So it's better to step back, right, and then look at the composition. Remember that these things are not what they are, right? We have to break them down from the ground up. So the very first thing in regards to unity that you could see is shapes, right? We have very simple shapes. We have shapes like rectangle, we have lines, we have circles, we have a curved line, we have a circle here, and then a whole bunch of lines as well here, as well as another circle right there, or those kind of very geometric shapes as well. So this composition is a whole bunch of geometry that retain the simple geometry that helps you with that sense of unification. Another thing that makes it unified, for example, is the fact that the paint in many ways, right, is fairly loose, right? It's not very well painted, not craft, there's not this so delicate application of paint in most of this whole thing. That is also a way of creating unity, right? There's not a one specific area that is very clearly painted correctly, right? Or not correctly, but to describe something in nature or hyper realistic to describe something else that we can recognize. That's more what I mean. Another thing that it creates unity, and one of the things that kind of it's right in front of us, but we sometimes tend to admit it, is the fact that everything in here is at the same level of decay, if I may say it that way. So the bucket, the chain, the wheels, all of these objects, including kind of the application of the paint, seems to be at the same level of decay or not as well kept. So let's say, for example, that this bucket is not brand new, and then the chain is old, and then the wheels are also brand new. There's a sense that all of these objects tend to have at the same level of disarray or decay or unwantedness type of thing, right? So that same level of decay also creates a sense of unity. Now, variety will be, as we mentioned before, separate, right? Kind of the opposite part of this composition. So we're going to have, even though we have shapes, we have lines, we have circles, we have all those other different shapes that I mentioned before, that creates a variety within that geometry that unified sculpture. Another thing that creates variety within the composition it's, for example, the paint we're talking about. Even though all the paint is done in a very loose manner, there are different kinds of looseness to it. So some is transparent, some is um, dripped, some of them is going to be layered, and so forth. Right? And then when we talk about all the other elements earlier, then we also have different kinds of um, objects themselves that puts this composition together. So we have a door, we have a chain, we have a bucket, right? So there are objects there in this repair, um, but they're all different kinds of objects. Now, one of the cool things about Robert Rauschenberg's work, and the best way to approach that kind of object is to understand kind of what was happening in the time period. And all of you have probably done a collage before, right? A collage. And if I was to ask you to do a collage of yourselves, or who you are as a person, you'll probably put all kinds of different papers right together that describes who you are. So if you give that to me, right, I look at it, it is not going to look like a picture of you, right? All of it are simplified, a simplified way, almost like symbols or analogies of who you are that describes who you are as a person, right? So it's this kind of minimization. But the collage never really looks like the original, right? So in this case, with this sculpture, it kind of works the same way. The difference is that Rauschenberg, was looking at a specific scenario. In this case, could have been outside the studio, and he was looking at what was out there, and he wanted to simplify it, right? And basically created a collage. That's what this is. It's a collage in 3D form and a 3D format, right? So let's say, for example, that outside his window he saw the facade of a building. There's a white door. They're probably fixing some of the building. So there's a bucket and the chain, maybe a cart in front of the building, and maybe a man or a gentleman wearing a very bright green tie, right? So all of those elements are very important within the composition of what he saw, and he diluted them down to the most basic of elements, right? And then created a three-dimensional collage of what he saw. And that's basically what you have in front of you. Nothing else, nothing more, nothing less. That's very, very much of a material, and that's where you're looking at. All right. If you want to know more about Robert Rauschenberg's work, obviously, always research more about his sculptures and time period of modernism. All right, let's move on to the next one. The next one's going to be balance. Balance. And balance is really interesting. You can achieve balance in two ways. You can achieve it symmetrically, right? Or you can achieve it asymmetrically. Symmetrical is the easier one. And I like this definition because it says the near or exact matching of two halves. When it comes to symmetry, it's very hard to find pure symmetry around the world. Now, we consider ourselves to be fairly symmetrical just because if you split it down the center, we kind of have the same information on both sides, right? That makes us symmetrical. However, how symmetrical that is, it is not very precise. So if you ever have taken a picture of yourself and split it in half and mirrored it, you'll notice that your left side and your right side really don't match. Most of us, anyways. So that's why I like that specific definition, where it says the near or exact matching of the past. Now, when it comes down to architecture tends to be one of those things in the world that tend to be fairly symmetrical in many ways. You can actually find true symmetry. Most of all the things is really hard to find true symmetry. Hopefully you can recognize this building, right? This is the White House by James Fulton. And here's an artwork. Damien Hirst, Kingdom of the Father. And these are all symmetrical pieces, right? So there's symmetry both in the center piece, as well in the side pieces, right? If it's split in half, it's very much same as the other, as well as the whole thing, right? So we split it down the center. This half is basically the same as that half. And that is symmetrical work. Now, this specific work is created 100% with butterfly wings. So really, really interesting work. That is not the only artworks by Damien Hirst that are made with butterfly wings. He just finished a series, I believe, last year, the year before, of mandalas with butterfly wings. So I suggest that if you like this work, find it interesting, go ahead and do a Google search and look at his newest work, the mandalas. Now, symmetrical balance is easy. Asymmetrical balance, it's slightly more difficult to achieve. You know? This is when both of the halves, right, have different characteristics. Halves without matching characteristics. A variety of elements used to balance the composition around an implied center of gravity. So in order for us to be able to balance the composition, then that's what you have to do. First of all, you need an implied center of gravity, and then you're going to have to apply elements in each side of that implied center of gravity in order to create that balance. So let's look at this, for example. So this is a painting by Degas. And Degas, in this case, for example, gives us the actual center of gravity or the line of gravity. It's going to be this one right here. It's very, very strong. And all the elements on this side right here, okay, visually weigh the same as the elements on this side right here, right? So that's what balance is. And there's several tricks that artists utilize in order to help that visual balance, that weight in one side of the other of the canvas or the composition in order to create that sense of symmetry. And one of the cool things that you guys have probably done this before without realizing, there's something about composition and aesthetics that becomes very natural to us, and we apply without even thinking about it. Some of them, not all of them. So let's go ahead and take a look at how you can. So there's a few little tricks we can do. If you have a large form, right, that large form is heavier visually than a smaller form. That makes sense. However, therefore, so if you put a big, large form and you add a whole bunch of smaller forms next to it, you can balance that out. So just to give you some really silly examples, I have this right here. So here we go. We have this large form, right? Then we have the smaller form. So obviously, this one right here feels heavier than that one, right? However, we can balance this one bigger form by adding a whole bunch of smaller forms, and all of a sudden we have visual balance. Now, our center of gravity here is going to be fairly right here in the center, right? But nevertheless, it kind of gives you an idea what I'm talking about. The next one, a form close to the edge is heavier than towards the center. So if we have an object, a large object, and have smaller objects towards the edge, and then this is going to create a sense of heavy. Now, this comes from a visual tension that exists when an object's close to an edge. Put a cup of water or coffee right at the edge of the table, and there's an uncomfortableness that comes with it. Visually, we have the same thing. So that uncomfortable, that visual tension creates perceived weight, okay, that allows artists to offset some of that visual weight. The next one's going to be a complex form is heavier than a simple form. Okay, so a complex form tends to have a lot of little objects, or it's colorful or whatever. So you can have this smaller, very complex form that has color, textures, all of those things offset this one large form. So previously we were looking at smaller, like simple forms, but this one in this case is a lot more complex. Now, shapes themselves are not the only thing that can create this sense of balance. Color can also help with balance. So for example, if you have a warm color, warm colors tend to be heavier than cooler colors. So if you have a warmer color that's smaller, that can actually balance out a much larger pool. And that's just part of how things are. Also, warm colors tend to balance towards the viewer or advance the viewer, tends to be closer towards us. That comes from our biology of our eyes. Our eyes are meant to see warm colors more than they are meant to see cooler colors. And that's just because our eyes are organized or biologically made to see sunlight and to see warmth, right? So that's why warm colors tend to advance or be much more prominent to us than cooler colors. So if you were to have two identical forms um, here, one warmer, one cooler, the warmer one would tend to look as if it was ahead of the other one. Later on in this PowerPoint, I'm going to show you an example where that's very, very prominent. So, another one, here it goes, an intense color is heavier than a pale color. That makes a lot more sense to people, especially when you talk about interior design. Imagine having a bedspread, the bedspread is a very light color. Then the only thing you need to put as an accent pillow would be a fairly bright color. And even though it's a small pillow, it can balance the composition of the bedding, right? So basically the same, right? So we have one large pale form right here, and then one stronger hue here, and then they balance each other out. And last but not least, we have a small form becomes heavier when the complementary color exists behind it. So the more complementary color we put behind that specific color, then the object becomes heavier and heavier. So here we have this one small blue object, and as we add more and more orange to this object, it becomes heavier and heavier and heavier. So when we look at a composition like Van Gogh's The Starry Night, which is fairly well known, right, you're going to recognize a lot of the same things, right? One of the things you're going to recognize, for example, is going to be, hopefully that you can recognize, I should say, is that there is a nice center of gravity. Actually, in this case, there's two centers of gravity. There's a horizontal one, right, that exists almost right here, which gives us a balance between the bottom area versus this top area, as well as a horizontal, as well as a vertical one, sorry, that exists right here, right where the church is at, where the elements on this side are basically balanced by the objects on this side. Now, if we're looking at what we're just talking about, right? For example, we have this large object balanced by a bunch of little small objects right here, right? Actually, we have a whole bunch more closer towards the edge. Also, if we're looking at it this way, right? We're looking at it from a horizontal perspective. Then we also have this small object compared to this object, right? Close to the edge, creating that tension right here. Another thing that we're talking about is going to be complex forms versus simple forms, right? So we can consider, this object right here, this really large object form. We have a lot of more smaller complex forms around it. Same thing as this really large kind of simple form compared to a whole bunch of other smaller forms that are more complex. Those things create a sense of balance. Another one, which is using color, for example, is warm colors and cool colors, right? If you were to divide here how much yellow, warm color, right, or red and orange there is in this canvas versus how much cool colors there is, you'll see that there's much blue or cooler color than warmer colors. However, the composition still balanced, right? That's because of that tension, okay? Also, another thing to think about it, I mentioned before, is the sense of cooler colors or warmer colors, I apologize, being in front of cooler colors, right? Do you read the stars in front of the sky or behind the sky, right? In this case, as always, I think, you will feel that the warm color, these objects are in front of or behind. They tend to be protruding out or being closer to us than the than the background of the sky. All right, so as you can see, all the things I just mentioned are applicable, and they are part of the composition of many pieces of artwork, especially those that are paintings, for example. They're flat, right? Um, One of those things that I like to show you with Starry Night with Van Gogh, very well-known expressionist painter and painting, is that I want you to show you that right here, you see all these brown spots, right? That is actually all empty canvas. See right here, the edge. All of those areas are actually empty canvas. So whenever you go to New York City, you go to the MoMA, and you get to see Van Gogh's Starry Night, you're going to realize that a lot of this painting is actually not painted. A lot of it's actually empty canvas. It's pretty interesting. Okay, now when it comes to three-dimensional artwork, all of the same things apply. So there's no reason to reiterate everything. But here in this case, we have this beautiful sculpture by Marcus Rivera in Los Angeles, and as you can see, it's a very symmetrical geometrical sculpture, right? Lots of line and so forth. Now, the next principle of design we're going to talk about is going to be emphasis and subordination. You have subordination in order for you to have emphasis, because emphasis is where your eye, your perception goes towards. So it's the area where your attention tends to be drawn to. Subordination is the neutral areas that keep the viewer's attention focused on that area of emphasis. Now, I want you to make sure you highlight, underline, and remember the word emphasis, okay? And the reason why I say that is because when you're talking about an artwork and you're trying to say, oh, this object or this image seems to be the most important one, a lot of people say, oh, it stands out, or it pops out of the canvas, or it comes, something in that regards, or grabs your attention or grabs your eye or whatever else. Well, because in this class we're trying to be very factual about what we're writing, what we're saying. An artwork does not have hands, so an artwork cannot grab your eye, an artwork cannot grab your attention, or those kind of ways of speech. What you're trying to say is that the artwork has emphasis and is done by this object, or emphasis applied by this color, or whatever you're trying to do. So make sure that you're using the word emphasis when it's the appropriate way to state it. Not something sticks out of the canvas, unless literally is sticking out, right? Or something grabs your eye. Just make sure that you're using the proper vocabulary. And in this case, emphasis, I know you're going to be needing it writing your document. All right, so let's go back to emphasis and subordination. All right, so let's see. So as I mentioned before, emphasis is where your eye goes towards, and that's why sometimes we call it a focal point. It's the area where your eyes are focused, right? There's the emphasis, and then your eyes goes in that direction. Now, for focal points, you can also create circles. That is one of the fastest and simplest ways to create a very important and heavy point of emphasis. Our eyes, our mind are constantly seeking circles. Why? Well, because the sun is a circle, because our face is a circle, our eyes are circle. So we are biologically attracted to that form. So if you wanted to create emphasis, a very exaggerated focal point, the very first thing you should do is to create a circle or something that's semicircular, and that would drag your attention to that point of focus or into that emphasis. Another way that you can create emphasis besides circle is you can have a very strong hue or a color that's heavily saturated, or a strong change in values. Any of those three things with color can help you achieve a very strong emphasis or a very strong focal point. Now, in the image that you guys saw, did anybody see any birds flying in the sky? All right, I'm going to show the artwork again. Just for a few seconds, I'm going to ask another question. Was there any flowers in the pot? Right? But I do want to ask you something. What's the thing that you do remember seeing? And I'm pretty much sure that the answer is going to be one big giant circle, orange circle. That I can bet you remember. Even for this slight moment of time, you will remember circle. And the cool thing is that in this case, I can show you that everything I'm just talking about regarding emphasis, as well as what I had mentioned earlier, um, it is all true, right? We are attracted to those things, so we are able to capture those things really quickly. So in this case, obviously, we have everything that I just mentioned. You have a circle, you have a hue, you have contrast with values, and so forth and so on. So this is a very strong composition focal point within a composition, right? I love this because this is part of Margaret's work as well, right? So this sense of reality of what art is, right? Before we had, is this a pipe? No, it's not a pipe. It's paint on canvas. In this case, is this composition. An artist is the one that has control over what you see on a canvas in a painting, and then he's given us this really strong sense of composition. Now he's playing with the placement of the sun as well, right? Where the sun is supposed to be behind all the trees and so forth. But at the same time, he's given us this really strong composition where the artist is the one in charge. Okay. And then we have positioning, which includes vertices and a few other things. So you can create emphasis in that way or a focal point in that way. However, sometimes in order for you to have a more settled way of creating composition, you can do it this way, for positioning. So positioning can be helped out, or the focal point can be helped out by creating vertices, or we can have directional forces, right? And that includes lines that actually are implied. So, for example, implied forms, which we mentioned before, right? So directional forces, it's a directional line, so straight lines, right? Or semi-curved lines or curved lines, things like that. And then you can have actual lines, or you can have implied where it seems like something is in one specific direction. And the other one that's a directional force is called a path. Paths are interesting because path is what happens like when you're walking down the street and somebody stops and looks at one direction, right? You're walking right next to them, and all of a sudden your eyes want to follow the same place where they're looking at. That's a path, right? There's no line, there's no specific, line's the only way I can describe it, whether it's implied or not, but rather is the direction of the eye. So you can also do that with a finger. Now, a finger could be actually a line of some sort, and you can say, well, there's an implied line there. But most of the times, a finger can create a path. So if I point in that direction, right, it creates a path which your eyes follow. So that's a path. So within a composition, sometimes you have those elements that your mind kind of captures, right? Your mind captures because of all those directional elements that exist, whether they are literally there or sometimes hidden in the composition. Let's take a look at this one artwork. This artwork is by Goya. So if we were to look at this piece and we were to say, okay, where's the balance between this composition? We're going to have a very strong sense of gravity right here, meaning that the amount of elements here, even though there's not that much in there, kind of balances out what's here. We're going to start with that. Oh, by the way, here we go. I got to see the actual print a few years back at the Kindle. We have so many great museums locally, and the curators of those museums as well. They bring us some exceptional artworks, and artworks that are part of our history. And I strongly suggest you take your time and you go to those places. I mean, I teach it, so and I love it as well. Don't get me wrong. But I want you to know that the artworks that I talk about are artworks that I've seen. Um, Actually, most of them I've seen personally, so I know what I'm talking about. You have to go to museums, guys. You have to see the artwork in order for you to experience. All right, so let's go back to this. Oh yeah, so here we have it, and then we have the center of gravity. And really nice strong line that happens there. Now, we talked about vertices. Vertices are places where two lines intersect, right? So where do you see in here where two lines intersect? We have one beautiful strong line right here. Look, it intersects right there. So we have one vertices there, and then the other one right here. Line just showed up. So we have two strong vertices. Now, I find it really intriguing and really interesting that Goya actually puts a hand in both of those, almost as a circle, putting a circle right in the edge of those, creating a very strong sense of focus right there to show us the matter of the world. Okay. Now, there's other elements here that are much more hidden regarding where you want our eyes to kind of focus. And those are going to be paths, or we're also going to have some implied lines. So there's some implied lines, for example, that come from the shape of the leg of the cow, the bull, into the shape of the figure here, right? So we're going to have that line that exists right there. Now, we also have a couple, we're going to have other two lines related also to, for example, the legs of the animal and the tail, right? And then we have another one that's really interesting that is created through this black and white, this negative and positive that exists right here. So you can see it here, where the color kind of stops, and then it goes back to negative and positive here in the black and white right there. And it's kind of a very hidden but fairly effective line that comes all the way down right here, basically to the snout of the animals. Right. So far we have all these lines, right? And then there's one more, couple more paths that exist here. So especially the one from his eye, that one path that we're talking about. So we have a path, and last but not least, this beautiful one line that we have right here at the bottom, that's created by the shadow. Right. So here we have a very light composition where eyes are kind of triggered to stay within this triangle of the legs, eyes, and the shadow. And then we also have this too, that aid with the assist, with aid to the kind of direction of what we're looking at. All right. The last part, the other way you can create emphasis is by doing something much more drastic to the object, by really abstracting it and changing it. So you can either distort or exaggerate elements of the composition, and that can also create emphasis. And Margaret helps us with another painting right here, right? So The Art of Living by Margaret. So here we have it. So emphasis, right? Very strong emphasis. That giant, oversized, manipulated head that looks like that much. All right. So the next principle of design is going to be contrast. And once again, back when opposites. I mean, there's just one word. Contrast just means the placement of two opposite things in the same composition. So the juxtaposition of strong, similar elements. So for example, dark and light, large and small, bright and dull, symmetric, thin and thick, and so forth and so on. So here's a great abstract that I really like. It's a very, very well done abstract, I think, right? With a lot of contrasting elements. So what are some of the contrasting elements that we have? So we have a very strong geometric shape, organic shape, sorry. And then we have some strong geometric shapes here, right? You can say warm and cool colors. So we have reds and yellows, and suppose we have greens and blues. We have different line qualities. So we have some thick lines, we have some thin lines. Okay. We have black and white, also called those, opposites. You can have large and small. So we have small rhombus here, and then we have the large ones here, and then even larger ones here. Okay. Trying to think what else. So we have light and value-wise, we have a light value and and a darker value. So we have this kind of limey light green with this darker green right there, right? So all of those things create contrast and creates a very, very interesting composition using contrast. Now, I mentioned this before that this is an abstract, right? Remember that an abstract is when you take uh, something from nature, something that's representational, something that's from reality, and then you take it away from it until you bring it to just most basic elements in some cases, or sometimes slightly beyond that. But the idea is to take away, to abstract, to take away. And in this case, I find this to be a very accurate, very interesting, very well done abstract. And it's called Woman in the Mirror, O'Connell. If you were to look at this from a very simplistic, almost, I would say, symbolic way, I would say, right? You can identify all the elements that he discusses. He's talking about in title Woman with Mirror. So we have the back wall right here, or the wallpaper from the back wall. We have a representation of the woman right here. We have the carpet or where she's standing at here. Then we have the mirror that is described by this really sharp object, and then the other wall on the other side. So here we have the full room plus the woman and the mirror. Okay, the next one is repetition. This one's an easy one. We can recognize repetition fairly easy, right? There's two things to keep in mind with repetition. One of it is going to be pattern, and in that one you can recognize pretty easily. It's just the combination of elements or shapes repeated in a recurring and regular arrangement. Very, very easy to recognize, right? So here we have another painting by Margaret, right? If we're talking about pattern, what would be the pattern that we have? So we have a pattern of male figures here, right? We have all kinds of different male figures. They're all dressed very similarly, so we can talk about that in the pattern. We can talk a pattern of this geometric shapes that look like windows, right? As well as the pattern possibly of the red rectangles on the roofs, right? So all of that is part of the pattern. It's very much a painting of pattern, and that's Gioconda by Margaret. Rhythm is slightly more difficult, and rhythm, and the reason why it's called rhythm is because it does have to do with the way the speed in which things within a pattern, whether they're kind of fast or slow. And rhythm, which is attached, a word that's attached to music, it is very much like music, like a sound wave, right? But visual. So things may seem fast or slow. So when we're looking at this pattern, would you consider this pattern to have, what kind of rhythm? So we can say this is a very strong rhythm, right? It repeats over and over again, but also the same, the variety of that same repetition. So you can even call this a fast repetition or a fast pattern because of how much there is. And all of the things I'm saying are kind of tied to the way you would talk about music as well, right? Another thing you could talk about in rhythm in this case is a very symmetrical pattern. That's the symmetrical rhythm as well in here. The rhythm happening on the top half is the same thing. Well. So rhythm is a lot harder to find, or not to find, but to describe, to be able to catch it. Because we can see the pattern a lot faster than we can see the rhythm. If I was to show you, for example, go back to show you Margaret's work right here, right? You will see that there's the rhythm here is a lot slower, right? There's not that much sense of movement. So the rhythm in here could be described as much more not solid, but slow, right? Or almost frozen. Very little rhythm, I should say, right? Well, the rhythm is based on the repetition, right? There's a lot of objects here, but not much movement compared to this one. All right, Fred Tomaselli. Now, the cool thing about Tomaselli's work, I got to see Tomaselli's work at the Modern a few years back, and this specific painting, or not painting, this is not a painting, the artwork, it's about the size of a whiteboard on a classroom. So it's fairly large. And on all of these objects right here, I'm going to show you a close-up of it. Each one of these objects were cut by hand, right? So, and they're all come from, nature magazines and all the kinds of magazines. We have hands, we have birds, we have all kinds of, flowers and things like that. And every single one of these elements have been cut out from that, which is really, really, really interesting, really tedious. I mean, I myself do a lot of repetition in my work, but this takes it, and it's not the only one, right? So from the series, there's a whole bunch of them that you can check out, how you can see. So take a look at his work online. There's some really, really interesting stuff. All right. Last but not least, we have scale and proportion. Once again, there are two elements. They're not specifically opposite from each other. These ones are much more complementary, but you have to understand what scale means and proportion means, because a lot of times we talk about these things art, and we need to make sure that we know what we're talking about and how to properly describe it. So let's talk about scale first. When it comes to making artwork, right, one of the very first thoughts from an artist is going to be how big an object is, right? How, placement in space and some sort, right? But also the composition of appreciation of the viewer. So most of the time, scale or size tend to be one of the very first thoughts of the artist. And within that thought of scale, then it also comes format. And by format means kind of the shape in some ways of the object, but also how big, how tall, by how long, by how wide something's going to be. So that's kind of what formatting means. And in many cases, we're talking about the area that's going to be covered. You have heard the word formatting when it talks about television, movies, right? So we have here there's some of the examples for movies. So we have 4:3 to 1, 16, and so forth. So that's one of the very first thoughts. So with scale, the way to think about scale in general is that scale is the size relationship of one thing to another. Now, when it talks about regular size objects, right, we tend to describe something where there is larger scale or smaller scale based on our perception of reality, right? So, for example, if I have this Red Bull can, right, and it's a regular size scale, but if I create one that's, this tall in my studio, then that's a large scale can, or I can make a replica that'd be a small scale can. And we are basically comparing it to our natural size, or to our regular size, which is our own scale. That'd be human scale or natural scale. All right. Proportion, on the other hand, is the relationship of the parts to the whole, right? So proportion meaning, for example, my hand, right? So my hand, for example, right? My fingers are proportional to my hand, or to my whole hand, right? That's what proportion means. So parts to the whole, parts to the whole, I mean. So let's take a look at some artworks and describe scale and proportion. One of the important things about the perception of proportion, okay, is that our eyes, our minds tend to read objects differently based on the elements that surround it. So when you're looking at these two compositions, right, and if I ask you which one of those two, circles in the center is bigger, right, you're probably going to say that this circle right here is bigger than that one. Well, that's incorrect. They're actually both exactly the same size. However, our perception of those things change because of the element that surround it. So that's extremely important when it comes to art, because in many, many, many cases, artists tend to play with that perception part of it. So take a look. Let's take a look at this artwork right here. This is by Claes Oldenburg, and these are shuttlecocks. Okay, these shuttlecocks, and they're placed, both of them, in the middle. Whoops, the middle of a field. So what would be the scale of the shuttlecocks? Right? These are very large scale shuttlecocks, and hopefully you know what a shuttlecock is. So it's this little object that looks like it's ball with feathers type of thing, and is used to play a game similar to tennis or kind of in between those two, right? Now it's normally associated with the kind of the higher class, and it's part of the reason why this. So here we go. So we're talking about scale. So scale, they're large scale, right? Very large scale. And then we can talk about proportion. How is it that they feel like they fit within this space, right? Well, you can say because they are proportional to the field, because these objects are within a very large open space that is in some way proportional on size, right? Also, there's only two of them, and then we have this really large building in the background. So it helps with the sense that these two large objects tend to inhabit or be part of that whole in regards to the size. Now, imagine if the building was a lot smaller and this whole green field was a lot smaller, and those objects were the same size. Well, there would be something awkward about it. It would be very uncomfortable. Now, some artists would do that on purpose, don't get me wrong, but then in this case, they are proportional, right? All the large objects seem to be kind of in proportion to one another, including the two shuttlecocks. Now, one of the things to consider about Claes Oldenburg is that he is a pop artist. Okay, here's another one of his works. Right? This is Pie, 4K. And with 4K, just like with any of his work, one way to identify it, and the reason why I'm saying this is pop, is because pop art is not because it pops out or because it's shiny or colorful. That's not what pop's about. Pop is basically, pop art comes from the word of popularity and consumption more than anything. Things that are being consumed or being obsessed by the culture in general. So it's popular, it's consumable, it's the want, right? Now, Claes Oldenburg, one of the things he does is he literally transcribes the want into this kind of size object thing. It reminds me of, I don't know if you've ever seen episode of Futurama, right? There's an episode where they're talking about it. There's this alien thing that you have this individual that's an actor, and the more he gets praised, the bigger the it gets, right? And it's kind of this dog-looking thing. Anyways, that's similar to what Claes Oldenburg does with his objects, right? The more society, the more popular want somebody culturally wants something, the bigger these objects kind of gets, right? So who doesn't like pie or cake, right? So you have a really large slice of cake. And then on the other one, slice of cake. And in a different kind of slice of cake or society, then we have two shuttlecocks, really large and universally, right? And in this case, it's a little bit of this social commentary with this artwork because of who we associate normally in the shuttlecock or this game to be played. Who plays this game, right? So it tends to be kind of a upper class, people with a certain amount of money, as well as much more of a kind of a white Anglo-Saxon game than it is in the other culture. So there's a little bit of that context of this want we want that, right? So really interesting. All right, here's another one of very interesting and really wonderful piece that deals with scale and proportion and in a very, very subtle but very active manner. So when we look at this figure right here, the standing figure of an old man, right? What scale is he? it's a small scale, right? Well, how do we recognize that it's small scale, right? Well, because we can see that these are pavers, right? And the pavers, based on our own, size comparison, they're regular scale. So because those are regular scale, then this little gentleman is very tiny, right? However, we can still recognize that there is something happening here, and we can see what's happening, right? So we have, once again, this figure standing in front of what it seems to be a grave of some sort, because we have this object here, and we can recognize all of that happening right there. So how do we know that this figure as well as this element all are together, and that we can recognize this as a moment of an individual paying tribute to somebody who passed away, kind of in a gravesite, right? What how do we know that's happening? Well, the answer is on proportion. The reason why we can recognize all of those elements together is because this object to this object to this thing right here are proportional. Because of the proportionality of all of those objects, we can recognize that as one scenario. If this object, let's say, if this um, cross was really large, right, it wouldn't make any sense. It wouldn't make the same kind of sense, I should say, as it is when it's this scale, right? And same thing with the little gentleman. What if it was a lot taller? If this figure was a lot bigger, then it still wouldn't make sense, right? This will not be the burial site of possibly another person, right? But rather an animal or yeah. So scale and proportion is very, very important. And proportion allows us to create a sense of unity, a sense of congruity between all of the objects in specific sculpture. So one of the things about proportion, let me go ahead and move on to this one. You have to understand that artists manipulate, artists control the perception of things, right? So with artists in the Middle Ages, for example, this kind of artists that we talk about in society and say, oh, this is absolutely perfect, it's beautiful, it's perfect proportions, and you can see the human body, how perfect it is, and all these things. You have to you have to really step back and remember that these are pieces of rock that are being sculpted, and that there's an artist, a mind that is pushing you into describing um, something in a specific way. So, for example, this beautiful painting of sculpture of the Pietà is very much out of proportion, right? If the figure of the Madonna of the Virgin was to stand up, and Jesus was to stand up right next to each other, the Madonna will be way taller than Jesus, way taller, right? Now, Michelangelo in this case sculpted it in such a way so that it seemed like this form, this female figure, can actually hold the body of Jesus as if he was still kind of an infant, a baby, right? Also, another thing that he wanted to do was to make her feel bigger, right? Stronger. So Mary in here seems to have the shoulders and the physique, upper body and hands of a large man almost, right? Like an upper body, like a football player of some sort. And all of that is there so that you can increase the sense that this woman can actually hold a dead man's body, right? Imagine if really Michelangelo was to be true to realism, to naturality, to the way really things are. Well, the Virgin Mary would be really, with something heavy in front of her. She wouldn't be this comfortable holding this man, right? So all of those things have to understand that when it comes to artwork, artists are have an agenda of some sort, and you have to really take grain of salt everything you see. Another thing I was going to mention is how is it that we see the perfection in so many ways, though it's so quote unquote imperfect? Well, simple. Remember what I mentioned earlier about putting objects around something in order to hide it, right, or to manipulate it. In here, the way that Michelangelo is allowing us to kind of not see the obvious um, manipulation of proportion here and scale, what he does is he adds all these ruffles and all this clothing and all this other elements, textures and lines and whatever else on the body of the Virgin, so we don't recognize those alterations in proportion and scale. All right, which are really, really interesting, I think. Right. So be careful when you say or when you think that certain things in history are better than because they were very attuned to proportion, very attuned to things. Because the reality is that they manipulated the elements of art and design as much as contemporary artists do. They just do it in a different manner for a different purpose. Here is a different time period, same subject matter, same kind of reasoning, right? Now, in this time period, right, the need for representation of the human body and the perfection of the human body was not as important, but rather conveying the pain of Virgin Mary and Jesus, right? So that was more important at this time period when this was created than the Pietà by Michelangelo, right? So in this Pietà, what do you see the emphasis to be? And what's out of proportion, out of scale? Obviously, the heads are what's out of proportion, out of scale as well, right? They're much, much, much larger. Why? Well, because definitely you can see the pain and the anguish in these faces. And that's what this time period require artists to express or to help express to their artwork, right? So you can see, the wounds of Jesus bleeding here, right? And then you can see sad Mary and as well the pain of the face of Jesus. So be very, very mindful when you are looking at art through the years, because we tend to judge artworks based on proportionality, scale, and those kind of elements when we really need to be judging them by many, many, many other things, all the elements of design that we talked about. And additional, some more things we're going to continue to talk about, and that's going to be, especially when we get into art history, what was happening in that period and what was the purpose of art at those time periods, because it changes, right? Including nowadays. The purpose of art, contemporarily speaking, is moving certain ideas forward, and ideas, not ideas that are 100 years old or 200 years old. All right, guys, or older than that. So that's it for today, and we'll get the next PowerPoint next time.